Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our newer webinar series that we're calling Science at the Edge. I'm your host, I'm Kristan Uhlenbrock. I'm the director of the Institute for Science and Policy. Really excited to see where some of you are joining us from today. If you had heard Nicole say, this is the second part in our series where we are exploring new ideas and innovation in science and technology through the lens of how it's influencing society and vice versa. We hope to bring you a really broad range of topics. And today we're bringing you one that I know has a lot of our attention, I'm guessing if you tuned in today, which is discussing carbon capture. Carbon capture technology has absolutely seen a resurgence in not only attention, but also money as part of a potential solution to combating climate change. But there are many, many questions that we have about its effectiveness, its cost, and its role in transitioning some of those really hard to decarbonize sectors. So I'm really excited for our guests today who are going to have a really thoughtful deliberation and conversation about some of the potentials of carbon capture technology, as well as some of the trade-offs that we're experiencing. So I have two people joining us. I have Will Toor, who many of you on here may know. Will is the executive director of the Colorado Energy Office. He's been there since 2019. Before joining the Colorado Energy Office, he had a number of roles and hats, including serving as county commissioner and mayor of Boulder. He's got a PhD in physics. It's great to see here and work again with Will. Will, thank you for being here today. How are you doing?
Thank you. It's great to be here today. Doing well.
Thank you. We also have Ahmed Abdulla joining us. Professor Abdulla is a professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering with Carleton University, as well as having an appointment in engineering and public policy with Carnegie Mellon University. He can correct me if that's not correct. And he definitely works on questions related to energy policy and the challenge of deeply decarbonizing our electricity sector. He also has a wonderful PhD in engineering and public policy. So we are in great hands with lots of really smart people today, not only from the technical side, but from the public policy side. Ahmed, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. And you're joining us from Ottawa, correct?
Yep, Canada.
Yep, wonderful. Yes. Okay, so just a couple things for our audience before we jump right into this conversation. Nicole mentioned, and you probably heard it, and you're probably familiar with now, we have a chat feature in this webinar series. I encourage you to open that chat. We can see your questions, and we will try to incorporate some of those questions throughout today's conversation. We really love the types of questions that we get and seeing them, but we don't always get to all of them. So just be aware that if we don't get to your question, my sincere apologies in advance, but hopefully we covered a theme or a topic related to it. But you're welcome to share them as we go throughout today's program. We have a recording available immediately happening right now, will be available afterwards. So you're welcome to share that with anyone who you think would be interested in seeing this talk. And we'll send that out in an email following today's program. So you're going to hear a couple acronyms today. Just want to kind of set that stage here. There's two kind of big ones that people have either read about and you may already know about. One is called CCUS. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is what that stands for. So if folks slip into that, just know that's what we're talking about with that acronym. Another common acronym in this world is DAC, which is direct air capture. And again, we'll kind of explain those here. And I actually think we're going to maybe start right at the top. I'm going to turn with Ahmed. Ahmed, can you just do that kind of big picture overview? Give us this pleasure of describing what is some of these technologies that we're referring to.
Well, you'll be the judge of whether it's a pleasure or not, but it's really a very large cluster of technologies. So when people talk about CCUS, it's not a single thing. It depends on what sources you're capturing the carbon from, which sinks you're putting the carbon into, and that could actually dictate your support or opposition as a member of the public. It could also dictate the amount of incentives or revenues that you could get from the technologies. Broadly speaking, these are technologies that aim to remove carbon generated by human beings and use them or fix them in a way that they wouldn't be kind of contributing to our greenhouse gas problem. So it could be capturing them from industrial facilities, it could be capturing them from oil and gas wells, from power plants, or just taking them out of the air directly. And then the use part is putting it into the ground where it will remain permanently underground for centuries, or actually using it for whether it's carbonating beverages, or making durable carbon, like carbon nanofibers, or of course, enhanced oil recovery, using the CO2 to generate more oil from depleted oil fields. So it's a really wide cluster or suite of technologies.
Great, thank you. So so we're going to unpack some of the technologies first too, but let me bring Will into the conversation and then we'll kind of see how we go there too. So Will, you obviously are heading up our state planning here in Colorado around our greenhouse gas roadmap and we've had some number of work recently here related specifically to this technology. So how do you view this technology as a piece of the bigger part of your work?
So, to give it some context, our legislature has adopted climate targets for the state of 50% cut in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels economy-wide by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And the administration has developed a greenhouse gas roadmap that is really the strategic planning for how can we achieve those targets. Our work to date has largely focused on the 2030 target. And the initial roadmap really identified the 5 sectors that are responsible for the large majority of our GHG emissions. So electricity, transportation, industrial emissions, methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, and combustion of fossil fuels in buildings. And we built sort of sector by sector policy framework that aimed at achieving those 2030 targets. The core of our approach really does rely on decarbonizing electricity generation. And we're on a trajectory right now where, based on adopted plans, by 2030, every coal plant in the state will be retired, largely replaced with wind and solar, and it will be about an 85% reduction in GHG emissions from the electricity sector. And then we are really trying to maximize the benefits of that through widespread electrification in other sectors, including transportation, widespread use of heat pumps in buildings, as well as opportunities for electrification in the industrial and oil and gas sectors. But that's not going to get us all the way there, certainly for the 2050 target. Though, electrification and renewables in the electricity sector are our key near-term strategies. But if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050, we're going to need to look more broadly than that. And so there's a set of emerging technologies, including geothermal, electricity generation, use of geothermal heat pumps, manufacture and use of clean hydrogen, and the potential of both CCUS and direct air capture that we think are very important going forward. We're in the process right now of doing the first major update to the greenhouse gas roadmap. We're calling it the Roadmap 2.0 process. And we've gone through the initial public process. We'll have additional opportunities for public input throughout the rest of the fall before completing it towards the end of this year. As part of that, we are really trying to map out the role of these emerging technologies. So that's sort of the context that we're looking at carbon capture in.
Thanks. Ahmed, would you pull that picture up for us? I appreciate that, Will, right? We have targets not only here in Colorado, but globally that we are trying to achieve to figure out how do we solve for the carbon emissions and our climate change. So take this technology lens a little bit bigger. What do you see happening as far as trends of use and uptake, not only here nationally, but internationally? This technology isn't new, but we are starting to see it's having a lot of attention right now. Will you give us that landscape assessment?
Yeah, most of the studies suggest that we will need to deploy relatively significant amounts of carbon capture. That could be bioenergy with carbon capture. So this is growing crops and then harvesting those crops specifically to make power. It could be direct air capture. I mean, Canada's 2030 long-term strategy document, for example, says we might need up to 200 million tons of removal per year by 2050 from direct air capture. But studies, these are all theories, right? These are all pathways that are kind of modeled, but it says nothing about actual implementation. In terms of implementation, we're seeing large projects being announced in places like the US, in places like Canada, driven entirely by policy. So the Inflation Reduction Acts, the infrastructure bill in Canada, the huge Canada Growth Fund and investment tax credits that are now being proposed, these are making jurisdictions that can't see a pathway without oil and gas, especially, kind of double down on carbon capture. And they're making jurisdictions that value industry and don't want to deindustrialize, whether it's cement or steel or ethanol, also look at carbon capture. But really the driver of the renewed interest, as you called it, Kristan, was the policy initiatives over the past 2-3 years that have come to the fore in North America. In places like the UK, Europe, the discussion is growing, but not at the same level. And in places like the Middle East, which could actually deploy a lot of carbon capture, or China, the discussion is relatively muted because the plans for net zero by 2050 are also relatively kind of muted if they exist at all. So it's important to kind of take that jurisdictional and existential facets into account. Places like Alberta, places like North Dakota, they don't see a future without oil and gas playing a huge role, and therefore clearly they're doubling down on carbon capture. What that means is that their deployment hopefully will generate a lot of lessons that other jurisdictions can then utilize to get the costs further down and to implement it more successfully.
Would you both, and maybe I'll start with Ahmed and then we'll tap into this. So we've got some policy drivers here happening. With technology that I'm hearing isn't quite ready at scale, right? So talk to us a little bit about where this technology has advanced, put that into context of perhaps even more familiar technologies that are more, proven. I'll offer that as a term, knowing that we are proving and we have massive projects of these underway. Give us some of this, where are we in this kind of spectrum of technological innovation?
It's again difficult because of the sheer diversity of the technology. So some of these you said were not, you said they were not proven. Some of these we've been using for decades. They are proven. They've been proven and they've been scaled up as well. Other forms of carbon removal, like DAC, for example, direct air capture, are less proven in the sense that we're just building pilot plants now and starting to build the first commercial demonstration plants. The problem here is that these are all large projects. With large projects, the chances of things going off the rails is higher, inherently higher. Project management matters. Stakeholder alignment matters. These are big projects. You need to capture the carbon. You probably need to integrate into an industrial facility, obviously, unless you're direct air capture. You'll need to transmit the carbon with a pipeline or with a ship, and then you'll need to store a carbon. That's a lot of stakeholders along this value chain. And they all need to be aligned over the course of construction, but probably also over the course of the operation. So even if they're ready, commercially ready technologies, you could go to Mitsubishi and buy post-combustion carbon capture today, or you could go to Fluor or ConocoPhillips. These things exist commercially, but just getting these giant projects with their huge capital and upfront capital costs up and running is very hard. And getting all process engineering, in other words, engineering projects that have fluids running in them, like carbon capture, getting all of these things to operate as planned is also incredibly hard. It takes you years to get to your specified capture amounts. And so while they're ready technologically, the system itself, the integration of the components, running it to spec, that's less ready. And that's what the last generation of projects try to prove, with mixed success, I would say.
Will, any thoughts on examples of this technology? How are you all thinking about the readiness of proven technologies and new and emerging large-scale technologies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think a really interesting dynamic. I mean, the entire energy transition is really about sort of new technologies growing to scale. We've seen that with wind and solar over the last 20 years, with some remarkable price declines that have allowed that effective decarbonization of the electricity sector in a way that would have been kind of impossible to imagine how you would do that in an economically viable way 20 years ago. Similarly, we've seen the remarkable price declines in lithium-ion batteries that are allowing both stationary energy storage and electric vehicles to really start moving to scale. And I think there's lots of questions in all of the emerging technologies, including carbon capture, hydrogen, geothermal, advanced nuclear, about which ones are actually going to evolve to a place where they can really be successful at scale in the marketplace. Now, that said, when we were developing the initial GHG roadmap, we were looking at carbon capture very much as something that might play a role, post 2030, but that we didn't pay a whole lot of attention to as we were thinking about the next decade. Then we started hearing from multiple industrial operators in the state about projects that they were working on that they thought would come to fruition in this decade. So we started to hear more about the Wholesome Lafarge plant near Florence, and there were feasibility studies that they were engaged in on potential large-scale carbon capture. We began to hear from the ethanol plants in the Yuma and Sterling area about potential carbon capture projects. Ethanol is one place where carbon capture is probably among the most cost-effective because of the fact that the fermentation process creates a relatively pure CO2 stream, and so it's easier to capture. So we were hearing about those projects moving forward. Then we started to hear from the Southern Ute Growth Fund, who were working with a Boulder-based company, 8 Rivers Capital, on the initial work to develop what's known as an alum cycle power plant on the reservation. That I think is a very interesting technology that has been, I think, proved at small scale. It has not yet been implemented at a really large scale, but there are 50 megawatt power plants that have been built. That I think is a very interesting technology, and is probably the one approach to carbon capture in the power sector that has the greatest chance of success. So we started hearing about all of these projects that were at some level starting to move forward. And that's when we really decided, okay, we need to pay much more attention to the sort of medium-term prospects for carbon capture in the state, and start thinking about the appropriate policy framework for both encouraging those projects, valuing their emissions appropriately, and appropriately regulating them.
Go ahead. Ahmed, did you want to chime in there? Yeah.
I just want to chime in and say that the discussion is radically different in other parts of the world, right? So it's very interesting to hear this Colorado perspective. There are things that will happen regardless of what you do as a policymaker. Solar and wind will keep going down. Batteries will keep going down, right? I'd say nuclear power, it's going to be hard to deploy that in huge amounts in order to reduce its cost. So it will always be a premium, a cost premium involved with nuclear, but it's also a low carbon technology that merits a lot of attention. I think the carbon capture discussion, the renewed interest is not just because policymakers are facing the prospect of losing industrial sectors if they don't get this right? As Will said, the ethanol facilities, the cement, the steel. We're in Ontario here. We're desperate for carbon capture because we have a lot of steel, for example, and cement, and we've got no way of supporting those companies get to their net zero commitments. So I think the net zero by 2050 target helped crystallize the urgency of this in the minds of policymakers all around the world. And I think the fact that it's existential for some sectors, if you don't deploy it, then you will de-industrialize your jurisdiction, is also kind of one reason for this renewed focus.
So can we put some context around cost a little bit? And obviously the market that can follow. You just alluded to, obviously we've thought about this through the lens of renewables, right? And the deployability at scale. One of our guests, one of our participants was wanting to give that big picture context. I don't know if either one of you have these numbers, but like at what amount of investment and knowing technology the price of that would change over time, would be needed, right, to contribute to reducing into a net zero economy. Do we have that economic scale of the cost? Any numbers anyone has?
I'd be happy to take a stab at that.
Great,
and
thank
Will
you.
can correct me. But by the way, we've already invested billions, and by we, I'm currently talking about North America. We've invested billions in carbon capture, double-digit billions, and most of it has failed. So we have to be realistic about that and learn from the failures. In terms of what do we need, we actually ran a study with a group of experts who deployed these technologies in the past. So people who built the plants in Canada and the US, and they all said you need to build 8 to 10 of these demonstration projects, $1 billion each, in order to finally sort out the kinks that they're facing. So in terms of what level of investment do we need? To build those plants, you're talking $10 billion. To build the associated infrastructure, pipelines, things like that, would also be a substantial investment. Then again, these numbers are only for stuff that we've had experience with in the past, these large post-combustion capture facilities. The alum cycle turbines that Will mentioned, or direct air capture, would have radically different cost profiles. But we're talking about a multi-decadal, double-digit billion-dollar efforts on a national scale to get these technologies kind of down to the point where an investor could make a credible decision to go or no go. And that's hard, as you can imagine, right? That's not an easy proposition. At the same time, it's an order of magnitude smaller than the Inflation Reduction Act measures, right? So we have to keep things in perspective. This is doable, difficult, necessary according to some industries.
Well, anything to share there? I was thinking maybe we could talk a little bit about tax incentives that currently exist since we're already here. I do want to come back to some of the reevaluation of where these projects have failed and some of those whys and what are we learning from that. But let's stick with the cost, the economics piece and the market piece a little bit, right? We've got the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA is completely beefed up the 45Q here in the US. What are some of those other mechanisms that we've been seeing to help drive funding to this? And we had another person ask us about the role of a carbon tax in pairing it with this technology. Will, do you want to start? And Ahmed, please chime in as well too.
Sure, I'd be happy to. But I think as you noted, certainly the biggest investments will be from the uncapped tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. The increases to the 45Q tax credit, the increase for direct air capture, I believe up to $185 a ton. You know, those are going to have, I think, a profound impact on the investments that take place. The Infrastructure Act also has a sort of funding more in the single billions as opposed to the tens of billions level for essentially demonstration projects, you know, hubs for carbon capture and investment in carbon pipeline infrastructure that I think will be important in terms of moving some projects forward. But it's really those IRA tax incentives that are going to be the big dollars. From a state perspective, there are a couple of relatively small funding sources for carbon capture. So we have an industrial clean air grant program that has $25 million available, and an industrial tax credits that will generate a little under $200 million over the next decade, that a wide variety of industrial decarbonization technologies are eligible. These are competitive tax credits. So things like electrification, use of industrial heat pumps, the use of clean hydrogen, carbon capture are all eligible uses. And so we may see some projects come forward that apply for that funding for some of the capital costs of an industrial carbon capture project. The other place where, you know, in Colorado, I think we will see incentives that could move carbon capture along is through our industrial emissions reductions rules. So under statute, our Air Quality Control Commission has to adopt rules that will achieve at least a 20% reduction in industrial greenhouse gas emissions sector-wide by 2030. There is currently a rulemaking process moving forward, and in the draft rule, carbon capture is an eligible technology, and there is a trading mechanism among companies that, while it requires companies to essentially maximize cost-effective investments on site and to really focus on other air pollutant reductions, especially in low-income and disproportionately impacted communities, it does allow trading, which could allow capital from multiple companies to help one larger carbon capture project move forward at a particular industrial operator. So those are, I think, the major potential incentives at the state level.
So I'm very actually excited to hear that from all. I would say that one major problem with past CCS projects is this credibility of incentives issue. The incentives that were on offer were usually delayed. They were not very large. So they were huge amounts of money, but not large in context of what the investors needed to kind of make that decision and go for these projects. So we're seeing 3 or 4 different approaches to incentivizing CCS. It'll be very interesting to see in a few years which one succeeds. So the US approach has been that beefed up turbocharged 45Q. In Canada, we've kind of taken the concessional financing. So we give large grants upfront at very low interest rates. So Canada has taken the approach that the upfront capital cost of these projects is the big problem. So we're going to reward you for building them, whereas the US will reward you for capturing the carbon. So it's kind of more delayed, but the amount is so large that investors will still kind of gravitate towards that, of course, and supersize their projects in order to capture more carbon and get more money. We've also seen in some jurisdictions, Alberta, North Dakota, Louisiana, a completely kind of, there's incentives in terms of policy, and then there's regulatory frameworks, right? So we've seen a lot of development on the regulatory framework side. Alberta, for example, just decided 10 years ago that the pores underneath the ground, the subsurface into which you're injecting this carbon, that belongs to the Crown, that belongs to us. So you no longer own the pore space underneath your house. Alberta also decided that long-term liability cannot exist with companies that might go out of business. So it needs to rest with government. How do we fund that? For every ton you inject, you give us a certain amount of money. So it's like a fund, a post-closure fund, a stewardship fund that allows the province to kind of keep monitoring that the CO2 has been stored. So we're seeing a lot of very interesting legal changes as well as all the incentives. So it's not all about money. It's also about certainty in terms of the regulatory framework. And now we have 2 or 3 examples, Norway, Australia, and Canada, I'd say Alberta, where the regulatory frameworks have become extremely well developed. And so that will also increase certainty and help people invest in these technologies.
Yeah, I think, Will, go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to follow up on that by saying that that's an area of sort of very active work in Colorado right now. So in our last legislative session, there was a bill passed that gave what was at the time our Oil and Gas Conservation Commission the authority to seek regulatory primacy for Class 6 injection wells, which essentially means going through a process with the EPA to allow the state to regulate the injection underground of carbon dioxide. Currently, it would have to go through an EPA approval process, and given sort of the lack of funding and lack of staffing that the EPA has, that could be a very long process. So moving to a state regulatory process both gives us more control over the process and the ability to ensure that Colorado's values around environmental protection are respected in that process, regardless of what happens with administrations at the federal level, as well as likely will allow sort of more certain and timely processing. There was another piece of legislation that moved forward that broadened and changed the mission of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It changed it to the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. And so we are seeing that commission as really playing a central role, certainly in both geothermal, electricity, deep geothermal, as well as carbon capture.
I'd just like to kind of make a comment as well, which is that many of these clarifications of the regulatory framework have nothing to do with oil and gas, right? Let's say you're Bill Gates and you want to build $1 billion plant that takes carbon from the air and puts it underground, and you want to do it entirely out of the goodness of your heart. I don't think he's made that commitment. I encourage him to do so. But you need regulatory certainty for that. You need to know, you need the government also to have the expertise to monitor, to verify, to penalize if you do something right. If you do something wrong. And so we really do need much broader regulatory experience in states, especially states that don't have a lot of experience with this. And that regulatory experience takes decades, right? And needs to be carefully cultivated. So what we're talking about, some of these measures, like the regulations, they have nothing to do with the oil and gas industry. They are states trying to develop in-house expertise. And what does it mean to inject something underground, right? And what does it mean to keep it locked permanently? And how do we verify that? And how do we measure the tonnage of carbon that we're sequestering? So these have much broader implications than just the specific sector.
I very much agree with that. I would note, for instance, that the tax credit legislation we did at the state level that allows the competitive tax credits to be invested in carbon capture actually excludes projects that are using that carbon for enhanced oil recovery. We wanted to make sure that we're essentially having both permanent sequestration of the carbon and relatively straightforward greenhouse gas accounting, which I think is much more difficult if you're doing enhanced oil recovery. So we're not looking at banning EOR, but it is not the place where we would be putting investment. We also need to go through a process to really determine how we're going to do the greenhouse gas accounting for these projects. And we will certainly be making, I think, significant distinctions between something like EOR and other forms of sequestration.
We've got so much to pick up on here. Ahmed, are there other regulatory framework examples that you're seeing emerge?
So right now, let's say pre-2010, pre-2010, 2011, regulation worldwide was on a case-by-case basis. That is never a good idea in any industry, right? You don't want to regulate these projects on a case-by-case basis. It's just a nightmare. So in the past 10 years, we've seen governments like Norway's and the United Kingdom say that we don't trust you companies to live long enough to tell us that you're sequestering the carbon for decades. And so we've seen those countries decide that after you close the site and after you monitor that site for a certain number of years, 15, 30, then the liability kind of is transferred to the government. That's kind of the Alberta approach. After 15 years of closure, you get a certificate from the government saying we now own that CO2 and we own your facilities. In places like California, you need to monitor for 100 years. So it's a much longer monitoring period. In terms of the biggest challenge really has been pore access. In other words, who owns the pores underneath that storage site or proposed storage site? Alberta has really been the only radical player here that said we own all the pores, whereas places like Texas, Louisiana kind of have to negotiate leases for that pore access. It's going to take a while for states and provinces actually to kind of decide what's right for them. It's going to take a while to decide which storage sites to prioritize, because that will actually affect the regulatory framework you choose, and you don't want to choose a site that happens to be unique so that your regulatory framework only applies to it. There are federal, provincial issues, as I'm sure there are federal state issues in the US, right? So there's a lot to work through here. And it's going to take a while for regulatory clarity to emerge. Like Alberta's, I'd say, has been the most innovative, but also the most hard-headed. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We have the majority in the legislature, so we're going to pass it, which is, how government ought to work in a democracy, but also has generated some, as you can imagine, allergic reaction. The other good thing Alberta did, I would say, is splitting the value chain. In other words, you could be a CCS player and do no capture. You could just own pipelines. And you could kind of charge a fee for service. If someone wants to inject their carbon from their ethanol plant, you tell them the guidelines, what the carbon should look like. And then they charge you, you charge them per ton that you move through their pipelines. You've got hubs forming where people are responsible just for the storage and not the transmission or the capture. So the splitting of the value chain in Alberta has been very innovative because it meant that you as a developer are no longer responsible for everything, right? And you don't have to negotiate with people in a different municipality or a different county who don't know you, who don't trust you, maybe rightly. So that splitting of the value chain has allowed coalitions and consortia to emerge that are more organic.
Is that helping with permitting, right? So we have a question here from one of our guests about just the difficult environment that permitting is and heading to. Permitting and siting, I would offer both of those. Is this going to make it more nimble as you're potentially thinking if you're splitting that value chain up? Is it going to make it more difficult? What sort of infrastructure is needed? What sort of regulatory framework is really being talked about right now when it comes to permitting, both whether that's kind of the pipelines and then the storage? And I want us to talk a little bit more about storage too, but let's stick in this permitting regulatory framework a little bit. I don't know, Will, if you want to start it and Ahmed add into this as well.
Yeah. Well, I can say a little bit about it. I mean, largely what I would say is that there's a lot of challenges that I think Colorado still has to figure out. We're very much at the beginning of that process. So, on the storage side, there will have to be both significant public input and a lot of technical work done over the next year or two to develop the application to the EPA for regulatory primacy. So I think we'll be answering a lot of questions in that process. When it comes to a variety of other questions, so pore space ownership, the CO2 pipeline permitting process, we really did not touch those in the legislation this year. And so the question of which ones of those may require additional legislation, which ones of those will be able to be addressed purely through sort of regulatory decision-making by the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, I think is still a bit of an open question. So I would be very interested in hearing from Dr. Abdulla more about how this is being addressed in other jurisdictions.
Well, so permitting will always be longer than we'd like, and I think rightly so. Citing these things will be difficult because we know where the sources are, but the transmission corridors can always be a matter of a debate. We've also seen that the people running your project really matter. So for example, to give you an example, Petronova in Texas, which was this large coal-fired retrofit, CCS retrofit project. For example, they made it part of their standard culture and operating practice that they report spills of everything. If it's not water, you report it, even if it's a cup of something, right? So there's a lot, we've been learning a lot over the past 10 years, is my point, about the culture that goes with large-scale CO2 kind of moving about. There could be accidents. I think that's the thing that needs to be paid attention to most. These initial projects ought to have long permitting periods. They ought to be questioned, the people developing them, right? Because we know how to handle CO2. We've been transmitting it through pipelines for decades. This is technically not difficult, but as we know, you kind of need to over-design and gold plate everything in these first projects, especially if they're designed to be hubs or transmission pipelines that cross several states. I'd rather they be over-engineered. I'd rather we learn a lot from how to construct these things well, and I'd rather we spend a bit more time permitting them than the alternative, clearly. And I think we will end up doing that. I think the people who are projecting, pulling numbers at random here, a gigaton of carbon removal by 2030, really need to step back and kind of think of what that involves in terms of fleshing out the permitting issues, the regulatory frameworks. These things take a decade to build. So we need to be much more humble as analysts designing energy system transition pathways about CCS's role. And I completely agree that this will be a multi-decade contributor to 2050 rather than a quick fix. CCS is not a quick fix. It's a very delicate, fragile thing that needs to be very carefully managed if we want to radically expand it. And we definitely want to avoid accidents. We want to avoid legal challenges. I also think a lot of it rests with the developer, to be honest. For example, in Canada, you don't need a federal impact assessment if you're building provincially, unless you cross a body of water or unless you cross a border, an international border, i.e. with the US, or you cross a navigable waterway. As a developer, you can do things to eliminate some of the permitting challenges in terms of your siting and your overall plan, project execution plan. So a lot of this rests with developers having a very clear vision and having stakeholders who are aligned with them from the go, really.
One thing that I don't think either of you mentioned, but could you actually just lay the landscape of what it's meant to store? What are some storage options that are currently on the table? Any sort that seem riskier than others? Give us that purview, because I don't think we've actually talked about that storage piece yet. Who wants to go? I bet you both can answer this.
I defer to the physicist, but he doesn't seem to be biting.
He's looking to you.
Yeah. So when we say storage, use and storage are the two things, right? So when we say use, we refer to everything but storage, technically, right? So use of carbon that is captured can be in everything from the food and beverage industry, fire extinguishing industry uses quite a bit of CO2. It could be making durable carbon. It could be making synthetic fuels, which is where you take that CO2 and electrocatalytically reduce it to syngas, and then you could actually make gasoline and diesel from the captured CO2. But when we talk about storage, we are talking about permanent geologic sequestration. So going way beneath groundwater, way beneath any of these shales, and storing the storing the CO2 in depleted oil and gas wells, storing it in aquifers that are depleted. It could be storing it in other geological formations that we've studied extensively and we know can capture a lot of CO2. As you can imagine, these are rocks with tiny pores, just like the shale gas comes out of. So you'd be putting the CO2 back into those rocks. We've gained a huge amount of experience thanks to the US Department of Energy, to give them their credit, in how to characterize these formations, how to kind of estimate roughly how much they could store, and how to kind of drill the first few wells, the testing wells, in order to determine whether storage is feasible. But it's a monumentally difficult task. I could give you many anecdotes of companies that went through the regulatory process, thought they could store, found leaks that they have to plug all over the place. So again, this is a delicate, long-term process.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is, while I'm not a geologist, what I'm told by the people who understand much more about geology than I do is that Colorado is a relatively good place for potential carbon storage, both in northeastern Colorado, as well as potentially in southern Colorado. And interestingly, the Colorado School of Mines, working with partners, just received approximately $30 million grant from the US DOE to do a much more precise characterization of potential carbon storage options in southern Colorado. So I think we're going to learn a lot more over time about sort of where the best opportunities for storage are in the state.
Okay, let's take it into a little bit of a ongoing conversation, but different direction, and talk about the potential trade-offs of this technology. Specifically, I'm thinking about some things I've read around air quality versus the ability to capture carbon, obviously to reduce climate change. Ahmed, would you start with this? And Will, if you have anything to contribute to about what are some of these risky conversations that we're having around the potential trade-offs of certain technology?
So with carbon capture, it depends on, again, what the source is, right? So if you've got that ethanol plant that's just venting and 99 point something percent pure CO2 stream up a stack, there are no air quality implications and profoundly positive climate implications of taking that pure CO2 stream and doing something with it, right? And we've actually had plants do this in the US for a long period of time now. It's not new. However, if you're talking about CCS being used to extend the life of a coal plant, or CCS being used so that we could burn a lot more dirtier coal, then the air quality implications would clearly could be profound, right? Coal plants tend to be large, they tend to be long-lived. So CCS will only capture maybe 90%. So it gets more expensive to capture more and more of the emissions, right? So 90% is a sweet spot really, where you're making substantial climate benefits by capturing that CO2 from the coal plant, but it's not 100, right? So you will still be releasing some CO2. You might be releasing some pollutants that are governed or controlled. So there will be trade-offs. And I think that will actually dictate what gets deployed in the end, as has been mentioned already in this conversation. We've kind of, policymakers have wisened up to this, thanks to the net zero by 2050 target and thanks to public pressure. We've now developed kind of a two-lane system for incentives. Are you using this to further oil and gas extraction, or are you using this to permanently sequester CO2? The incentives could be different, as I think Will mentioned, when it comes to 45Q, right? But also, some states could make coal obsolete with other regulatory measures. I mean, even if you have 90% capture, if it's a giant coal plant, that will not chime with your net zero by 2050 goal, right? So there are other regulatory and policy measures that could dictate which sources get that carbon capture retrofit, so carbon capture plant. Will there be trade-offs? There are always trade-offs, right? And our task as engineers, whether it's analysts, policymakers, we want to make sure that we're maximizing the good and minimizing the bad. And we have to pay attention more to the bad because we know the risks of blowback and the risks of unintended consequences. So it's a trade-off that we have to deal with.
So I think that's a great description. And just to add a little bit more on sort of how Colorado is thinking about this, we clearly have some significant air quality challenges. So the Denver metropolitan and North Front Range area is in violation of federal ozone standards and has been struggling for a number of years to come back into compliance. We know that we have many disproportionately impacted communities that are impacted by very localized pollution from industrial facilities. So as we've built out sort of our industrial regulatory approach on greenhouse gas emissions, part of what we're trying to do is to really value and focus on reduction of other air pollutants in addition to carbon dioxide. And so under the proposed industrial GHG standards, you would have to first show that you had maximized cost-effective emissions reductions on site before you would be allowed, for instance, to be trading for CO2 reductions through CCUS at another site. And you would in fact be still required to do additional efforts to reduce other pollutants that impact both the region and the immediate neighbors. When it comes to the electricity sector, Colorado already has a requirement for utilities to file clean energy plans that achieve at least an 80% emission reduction by 2030. As part of that process, our utilities already have approved electric resource plans that will retire every coal plant in the state by 2030. So we are not going to be using CCUS on coal plants, even just from a pure economic perspective. We're in a world right now where simply operating and maintaining existing coal plants without CCUS, which adds cost, is somewhere around 4 to 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas utility scale wind is coming in at around 2 cents a kilowatt hour. There's no world where it would make sense, even just economically, to keep those coal plants operating. Where I think there's a potential role in the electricity sector is really as we think sort of post 2030 about how do we get from the 85% decarbonization pathway that we're on to something approaching, 100% carbon free. Our governor has a goal of 100% clean electricity generation by 2040. We're currently doing analytical work to map out a variety of different potential trajectories to achieve that. Could there be a role for carbon capture in that? I think that there could. And again, the technology that I think is most interesting there is the alum cycle. There's a company called Net Power that has really done the early commercialization of this, where you would essentially be burning gas in a pure oxygen environment, where the combustion basically gives you H2O and CO2. You can cool it down to condense out the water vapor and end up with a fairly high concentration CO2 stream. And what's interesting about it is because there's still an energy cost to create that pure oxygen, but it doesn't have to happen at the same time that you are doing the combustion. So you could use low-cost wind and solar to pay that energy cost. And it potentially becomes a very interesting technology that would have minimal emissions, at least as long as you're doing a good job of eliminating any upstream methane emissions in the process. So will we see CCUS playing a major role in the power sector? Certainly not in that first 85%. I think they're one of a number of technologies, including long duration storage, use of clean hydrogen, geothermal electricity generation, advanced nuclear, that are sort of all in contention, and all of which have major questions about which ones are going to be able to scale.
Great. Let's, in our last few minutes here, let's tackle just a couple things. I'd be curious, and this comes from both an audience question and something that we had talked about around any sort of thoughtful new ways of doing business, thoughtful strategies around community engagement when it comes to potentially siting of these projects. What would be some of those big things that you think should be done?
So one thing that I would say that is, I think, increasingly becoming part of the legislative structure in Colorado is a particular focus on impacts in disproportionately impacted communities, like communities that have been redlined in the past, communities that are subject to high levels of air pollution today, where in the legislation that passed this year, giving the ECMC the authority to seek regulatory primacy, there's specific direction around both engagement in disproportionately impacted communities, and that ultimately there has to be a finding that there are not net negative impacts in those communities before a project could be approved. I think that structure is something that is very important and that we will see going forward. The other thing that I would say that I'm hoping we'll learn a lot from, another piece of legislation this year required the Energy Office to work with outside consultants to develop a carbon management roadmap for the state that would really do much more to both quantitatively and qualitatively understand the potential role of a variety of approaches to carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal, And as part of that, there is a requirement for very broad community consultation, as well as working with workers and labor to make sure that we're looking at this, not just from a perspective of emissions reductions, but from a perspective of how does it affect communities and what opportunities does it give for good jobs for workers. I think particularly those workers who are potentially seeing jobs and skills that they've had in the fossil fuel industry perhaps transitioning.
Just to kind of give a broader view of this community engagement question, I'd like to say two things. The first is, there's a real need for humility here. There's a lot of studies about carbon capture and public perceptions of carbon capture. They don't really tell you much because people don't know the technology very well. The other issue is it could really depend on the whole value chain of the project. So what are you capturing from and what are you doing with the carbon, right? So if you're talking to someone who is very anti-oil and gas, if you say I'm capturing from a refinery and using it for enhanced oil recovery, you're probably going to get opposition, right? But if you're talking about direct air capture of CO2 and permanent sequestration, that opposition might become support. So the nature of the technology is that support or opposition will be fragmented. The other thing is that this is not a new nuclear power plant or a new wind plant, which sadly also get opposed, right? So you're not coming into a political economy and changing it by interfering with people's habits or infrastructure or aesthetics. We know where the sources are. People who work in those plants usually live around those sources. So there's usually a political economy that exists that is supportive of industry or of infrastructure development. This is not always the case. I'm saying it's probably more likely than a new wind plant. And so you might not get opposition for precisely the reasons we just heard. You might get a lot of support from people who want to transition from, the process industries to a new process that actually helps remove the carbon. So we need to be very humble, and I say that because engineers and project developers are often really bad at this, and they don't need to be. Obviously, one of my tasks is teaching my students not to be this bad at it. But community engagement is an art, a science. It needs to be open, transparent, accessible, two-way communication, literally co-producing the future with the people you're talking to. It can't be imposing things, whether they are values or actual pieces of steel. So will we get this right? I really hope we do. The community engagement thing we got wrong with nuclear, we got wrong with wind, and it set us back substantially, I think, especially with wind. I completely agree that we should be deploying a lot more, right? And in some places like Ontario, it's unclear if we'll ever get to deploy more, precisely because of opposition to wind. And that is a tragedy. It's a complete tragedy. So we need to get the engagement thing right.
Great, thank you. Let me leave you both with just a final closing thought, kind of a little bit of a grab bag here. If you want to give me something that gives you excitement, that you're somewhat optimistic about regarding this technology, something that you're quite concerned about, if you want to do both sides of that coin, I would love that. Or anything else I maybe should have asked you. It's something surprising that you want to share. I would love both of you to just kind of give me some final thoughts here for our audience. And why don't I start with Will, and Ahmed, why don't you close this out?
Sure. I think I would just say that one of the things I've been very excited about over the last several months has been conversations that we've been having with the state of Wyoming, a state that we've often clashed with on energy policy in past years. But our governor and the governor of Wyoming just a few weeks ago signed a memorandum of understanding for the two states to work together to advance direct air capture. And I think that kind of bipartisan collaboration isn't something we see very much, and is one of the things I'm most excited about right now in this space.
I'd say the sheer amount of activity, the kind of crystallization of the 2050 target in people's minds and in countries' minds, local jurisdictions, regional, global, gives me a lot of excitement. The fact that we got, for example, 25 new projects being proposed in Alberta in just one province, and Ontario's doing a lot of work on CCS as well to deal with its industrial sector's emissions. It gives me a lot of excitement. Another thing that gives me excitement is the fact that we have a lot more students who don't want to be just engineers. They want to be engineers and policy analysts and do some economics. In terms of skepticism and challenges, I think this will be once the rubber hits the road and we need to permit many, many megatons of carbon removal. I think permitting and public opposition and these things could rear their head, and we need to be prepared.
Well, thank you both. I feel like you gave us a lot to think about here. That's quite critical as we think about the future of this. Obviously, we weren't here to give people the answer, but just some of the thinking that's happening internationally all the way down to here in Colorado. I'm very grateful both for Professor Ahmed, Abdulla, and Will Toor for joining me today. And thank you all from our audience for tuning in and listening. Stay tuned. We're going to come back with a new episode, something completely different here in hopefully about a month. And we'll kind of keep you posted. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. And Nicole, drop some links in the chat there if you're interested. Take care.